So in this video, we're going to be talking about another major Supreme Court election and redistricting dispute that is now rapidly developing out of Virginia. But now we also have a major update directly coming from the Supreme Court itself, because the court has now officially denied emergency relief in this case. And all of this is likely going to reshape the upcoming elections nationwide and potentially the political makeup of Congress moving forward. So let's talk about what is now happening. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing another huge election and constitutional law dispute that is now colliding with the Supreme Court. The main case that we're going to be discussing involves the Virginia new congressional redistricting amendment and whether the Virginia Supreme Court actually improperly struck down that amendment, after the voters had approved it and after the Supreme Court reviewed it. Now, before we get into what is going on in Virginia and what the Supreme Court just said about that, we need to briefly discuss some of the other issues that have popped up that are also kind of major, and they're also reshaping this whole election and redistricting issue. Just last week, the Supreme Court issued a major order in a case out of Alabama dealing with Alabama's redistricting issues. Now, many of you probably remember a case back, called Allen versus Milligan, and that was originally started, I believe, around 2023, where the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's rulings, finding that Alabama's congressional districts likely violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, following that ruling, Alabama adopted a new congressional map in 2023. That map was also challenged again in federal courts, and the lower court again ruled against Alabama. However, last week, the Supreme Court vacated those lower court rulings and sent the case back down for reconsideration in light of the Supreme Court's newest decision in a case called Louisiana versus Calais. Now, procedurally, that is very significant because it shows that the Supreme Court may actually be recalibrating how the Voting Rights Act, redistricting claims are actually going to be analyzed going forward. And now Virginia has also entered the picture with their very own case and their own issue. The Virginia case involves a proposed constitutional amendment tied to the congressional redistricting. Now, Virginia lawmakers passed a constitutional amendment that would allow the General Assembly to redraw congressional districts outside of the normal census cycle under certain circumstances. The amendment then went through Virginia's constitutional amendment process and was ultimately approved by the voters in April of 2026. The new congressional maps associated with the amendment reportedly would have favored Democrats in 10 of Virginia's 11 congressional districts. However, Republican lawmakers challenged that in the courts, and recently the Virginia Supreme Court issued a 4-3 vote, striking down the amendment process and invalidated the referendum entirely. Now, importantly, the Virginia Supreme Court said that this was fundamentally a procedural constitutional issue. The court concluded that the General Assembly did not properly comply with Virginia's constitutional requirement involving the next general election before passing the amendment a second time. And this is where the dispute kind of becomes technical. The entire case largely revolves around the meaning of the term general election. The Virginia Supreme Court essentially concluded that early voting was part of the general election itself. Because of that interpretation, the court held that the constitutional amendment process violated Virginia's constitutional timing requirements, and that's why it was invalid. The court then ordered that Virginia had to continue using their earlier congressional maps that had previously been imposed by the court. Now, after that ruling, Virginia and the Democrats there and the Attorney General quickly filed an emergency application to the United States Supreme Court, asking for the Supreme Court to intervene on an emergency basis and grant a stay. Specifically, they requested an immediate administrative stay and asked the Supreme Court to block the Virginia Supreme Court's judgment and mandate while they prepared for a full petition for writ of cert. The state argued that the Virginia Supreme Court ruling was deeply mistaken on two critical issues of federal law with profound practical importance to the nation. Recently, the Supreme Court officially denied the emergency application. The court's order was extremely short. It simply stated that the application for stay presented to the Chief Justice and by him referred to the court is denied. Now, procedurally, this is a major development because it means that the Virginia Supreme Court's ruling remains fully in effect as of now. That means that the amendment remains invalidated, the Virginia Supreme Court's mandate remains active, and Virginia will continue operating under the prior congressional maps unless the Supreme Court later takes on this case and rules in their favor. Now, technically, this is not the final ruling on the merits of the constitutional issue that's involved, But Virginia Democrats and the Attorney General there can still file a petition for writ of cert asking for the Supreme Court to actually formally hear this case and review it entirely. But realistically, the denial of the emergency relief is usually not a great sign for the applicants. The Supreme Court declined to issue even a temporary administrative stay, declined to freeze the Virginia Supreme Court ruling, and declined to immediately intervene before the upcoming election cycle. And timing matters a lot in these types of election law cases. The closer that you get to things like election deadlines, candidate filings, ballot preparation, all of those things, essentially the less time you have to actually dispute these types of issues. Also, that means that Virginia has less time to get the relief that they want, and it's likely not enough time to get a full review of this case, even if it's granted review by the Supreme Court. Now, this case is important for a couple major reasons. First, it's another example of the Supreme Court increasingly being pulled into major disputes involving congressional maps and election administration. Second, because congressional districts directly impact representation in the House, these types of cases and decisions directly impact, those types of things going forward. What is the makeup of the House actually going to look like? And while the Supreme Court denied emergency relief here, Virginia case could still potentially return, but it's at least not going to impact the election cycle as of this year. So that is where things currently stand in these major redistricting disputes now developing around the country. Again, you have that Alabama case that was remanded back down after the Supreme Court, said that it needed to be reconsidered in light of the Louisiana ruling. Virginia's amendment was struck down by the Virginia Supreme Court. And now the United States Supreme Court has also denied emergency relief that would have paused that ruling. And at least for now, Virginia's prior congressional maps remain in place. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the case is completely done, but it means likely that the Supreme Court is at least not going to get involved on an emergency basis, and they're not going to change the outcome of this, during this type of election cycle. Now, one final thing that's important to understand here is why this case really matters far beyond just this whole election law issue itself. Congressional redistricting directly impacts the makeup and control of the House of the Representatives, and ultimately affects, everything from federal legislation, committee leadership, and oversight of agencies like the ATF and the DOJ, and also can impact those types of judicial confirmations and broader constitutional litigation issues that a lot of times also involve issues like the Second Amendment, which we talk about a lot here on this channel. So while this case fundamentally is about elections and other constitutional procedural issues, the downstream effects absolutely impact firearms and that type of policy and other constitutional rights moving forward. So as this develops, as we get more information, as this unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.